The date was October 21st, 1948, but inside room 237 of the Van Cleve Hotel in Dayton, Ohio, time had become a distorted, suffocating loop. Outside the glass, a relentless, icy rain hammered against the city, washing the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base into a smudge of indistinct charcoal grey. Inside, the atmosphere was even grimmer. The air was a stagnant soup of blue cigarette smoke, the metallic tang of unwashed coffee pots, and the palpable electricity of 5 men staring at the wreckage of their own ambitions. Edward Wells, Boeing's chief engineer, stood by the window, his reflection ghostly against the dark pane. For 2 years, he and his team had poured their souls into a massive turboprop beast, a logical, safe evolution of the B-29s that had firestormed Japan. They had millions of dollars in contracts, on full-scale mock-ups already being hammered together in Seattle, and a future that seemed set in stone. Then, in a single, brutal morning meeting, an Air Force colonel had walked in and casually shattered it all. The world had changed while they were drawing wings. The Soviet threat was no longer a distant thunder, it was a lightning strike. The Air Force didn't want a better propeller plane. They wanted a ghost, they wanted a jet, and they wanted it by Monday morning. "Start over," the colonel had said. Those words didn't just cancel a project, they invalidated 2 years of human life. The leather portfolios on the beds were now filled with nothing but expensive scrap paper. Most men would have packed their bags and surrendered to the impossibility of the task. But Wells looked at his team: George Scherer, von Blumenthal, Art Carlson, and Bob Withington. These weren't just employees, they were the high priests of American aviation. The room transformed into a war room. They didn't have the luxury of a drafting office or the quiet of a laboratory. They had hotel stationery, a single telephone line to Seattle, and the desperate adrenaline of men with their backs against a jagged cliff. Scherer began to sketch, his pencil flying across the paper to capture a radical idea: swept wings. In 1948, this was heresy. Most planes were straight, rigid, but to pierce the sky at jet speeds, they needed wings that sliced like a scythe. Von Blumenthal's slide rule clacked like a rapid-fire telegraph, crunching numbers on fuel consumption for engines that hadn't even finished their own test cycles. By Saturday, the fever had reached its peak. They needed a physical proof of life. Scherer walked out into the Dayton rain, searching for a hobby shop. He returned with blocks of balsa wood, model glue, and small carving knives. While the rest of America went to the movies or the park, these 5 men sat on the floor of a cramped hotel room, whittling the future of global power. The glue was still tacky, the wood still raw, but by Sunday night, the shape of the B-52 had emerged from the shavings. It wasn't just a model. It was a 33-page manifesto typed on a manual typewriter until fingers bled, proving that Boeing could touch the stars before the Soviets could claim the Earth. Approval was merely the beginning of a different kind of war. The scene shifted from the cramped room 237 in Dayton to the sprawling metallic cathedral of Boeing Plant 2 in Seattle. This wasn't just a factory, it was a 28-acre monument to industrial defiance. During World War II, this place had been shrouded in a surreal deception, a fake suburban neighborhood built on its roof to hide it from Japanese bombers. But by 1951, the fake houses were gone, and inside, something far more terrifying was taking shape. They called it the Stratofortress, but to the workers who spent their lives inside its shadow, it was simply the beast. The XB-52 was a logistical nightmare disguised as an aircraft. Its fuselage stretched 159 feet, a silver needle of stressed aluminum that seemed to defy the very concept of flight. The tail was so tall, standing 48 feet high, that it posed a structural paradox. It was taller than the factory's 35-foot ceiling. The solution wasn't to shrink the plane, but to adapt the architecture. Engineers installed massive hinge mechanisms so the tail could be folded like a broken wing, just to roll it out of the hangar. Every rivet, every panel, every one of the thousands of miles of wiring was installed by hand by men and women who treated tolerances of 1/1000th of an inch as a religious mandate. But the birth was violent. On November 29, 1951, during a full pressure test of the pneumatic system, a catastrophic failure occurred. An explosion ripped through the trailing edge of the wing, a metallic scream that echoed through the plant. The B-52 was crippled before it ever saw the sun. The project was on the brink, but the engineers didn't flinch. They rolled the second prototype, the B-52, to the front of the line. April 15, 1952, 9 a.m. The air over Seattle was uncharacteristically still. Alvin Tex Johnston, a man who wore a Stetson and cowboy boots into the cockpit, climbed into the tandem seat of the B-52. Beside him sat Lieutenant Colonel Guy Townsend. This wasn't a standard cockpit. It was a narrow, claustrophobic tunnel where the pilots sat one behind the other, more like a fighter jet than a heavy bomber. Beneath them, 8 Pratt & Whitney YJ-57 engines, the most powerful of their era, waited to be unleashed. When Johnston pushed the throttles, the sound didn't just vibrate, it tore the air apart. It was a physical force, a wall of noise that shattered windows miles away. The 405,000-pound metal whale began to move. At 140 knots, Johnston pulled back. The massive wings, designed to flex up to 32 feet under load, arched toward the heavens like the wings of a predatory bird. For 3 hours and 8 minutes, the world watched as a hotel room dream became a geopolitical reality. When Johnston landed, his report was a masterpiece of understatement. The airplane performed exactly as predicted. In those 6 words, the Cold War had found its ultimate hammer. By 1965, the strategic masterpiece born in a hotel room was no longer a theoretical deterrent. It had become a visceral instrument of destruction. The mission was dubbed Operation Arclight. From the humid runways of Andersen Air Force Base in Guam, the B-52Fs began to rise like prehistoric leviathans, pregnant with 30 tons of conventional high explosives. This wasn't the high-altitude nuclear duel the engineers had envisioned. This was industrial-scale slaughter delivered from the stratosphere. At 30,000 feet, the world below was an abstract mosaic of emerald green. The 6-man crew inside the pressurized cocoon of the Stratofortress lived in a detached reality. They didn't see faces. They saw radar blips. They didn't hear screams. They heard the steady hum of 8 jet engines and the rhythmic clicking of the bombing computer. When the bay doors opened, 51 bombs, 750 and 1,000-pounders, slipped into the void in a silent, synchronized dance. For 5 seconds, there was nothing but the whistle of falling steel. Then the jungle disappeared. To the people on the ground, a B-52 strike was not a battle. It was a natural disaster. You didn't hear the planes. They were too high, ghosts in the bright blue sky. The first sign of death was the earth itself beginning to liquefy. A single B-52 could turn a square mile of forest into a moonscape of jagged craters in 90 seconds. The overpressure didn't just kill, It ruptured lungs and burst eardrums before the sound of the explosion even arrived. It was a crushing, invisible weight that vaporized everything in its path. Back in Seattle, the workers at Boeing plant too continued their meticulous labor. They torqued bolts to exact specifications, X-rayed every weld for microscopic fractures, and calibrated hydraulic actuators with the pride of master watchmakers. They saw themselves as guardians of American safety. Robert Morrison, a technician who worked on the bomb bay mechanisms, once remarked that they thought about leak rates and tolerances, not the destination. The moral distance between a factory floor in Washington and a cratered field in Vietnam was thousands of miles, but the connection was absolute. The perfection of the machine made the devastation possible. The B-52 was working exactly as predicted, but for the first time, the prediction was written in the blood and ash of the Indochinese jungle. By December 1972, the moral and technical limits of the B-52 were pushed to the breaking point. President Richard Nixon, desperate to end the stalemate of the Vietnam War, ordered Operation Linebacker II, the most concentrated air campaign since World War II. It was known as the Christmas bombings. For 11 days, the sky over North Vietnam became a laboratory of technological horror. Over 200 Stratofortresses were diverted from across the globe to converge on the Red River Delta. Their mission? To systematically dismantle the industrial and psychological heart of Hanoi and Haiphong. But the North Vietnamese were not just waiting. They had been studying the iron whales for years. Surrounding the capital was the densest air defense network on the planet. Soviet-made SA-2 guideline missiles, massive, so telephone pole-sized projectiles, sat on their launchers, their radar eyes scanning the dark. The Americans relied on their cells of 3 aircraft, flying rigid, predictable paths dictated by computers in Nebraska. It was a fatal arrogance. Strategic Air Command believed that sheer numbers and electronic jamming would create an impenetrable shield. They were wrong. On the night of December 20th, the invincibility of Boeing's masterpiece shattered. As the bombers reached their release points, their massive bomb bay doors swung open, turning the aircraft from stealthy shadows into glowing beacons on North Vietnamese radar. At the moment of the post-target turn, a predictable banking maneuver practiced for decades, the B-52s pointed their jamming antennas away from the missile sites. They were naked. In a single night, 6 B-52s were blown out of the sky. The air was filled with flying telephone poles and the wreckage of multi-million-dollar machines. Brave men who had spent their lives maintaining the B-52 systems back in the States now watched from afar as their creations were turned into funeral pyres over the Red River. 31 bombers would eventually be lost during the war, many during those 11 days in December. In Hanoi, the Cam Tien Street Massacre became a testament to the unintended consequences of precision bombing. The B-52, designed to prevent World War III, had instead created a localized apocalypse. By the time the Paris Peace Accords were signed in 1973, the B-52 had left a scar on the earth and on the soul of aviation that would never fully heal. Decades have passed since the smoke cleared over Hanoi, and the world that birthed the B-52 is gone. Boeing Plant 2, the wonderland where the Stratofortress was forged, has been demolished, replaced by a quiet park where trees grow over the spots where the fuselage once stood. The hotel in Dayton has changed owners, and the slide rules have been replaced by supercomputers. By all laws of technology and logic, the B-52 should be a museum piece, a rusted relic of a forgotten era. Yet, it refuses to die. Today, the B-52 is undergoing a surreal transformation. Its original Pratt and Whitney engines are being replaced by modern Rolls-Royce turbofans. Its analog dials are giving way to digital glass cockpits. It is an old man being fitted with a bionic heart. There is a strange, almost haunting phenomenon occurring in the cockpit. Grandfathers who flew the B-52 over Vietnam are seeing their grandsons take the same pilot seats today. It is the only weapon system in human history where 3 generations of the same family might fly the exact same airframe. But the legacy of the B-52 is a double-edged sword. To the engineers in the 1950s, it was a triumph of mathematics and metal. To the crews, it was a home at 40,000 feet. But to the villages in Laos and Vietnam, it remains a symbol of an invisible, impersonal death. This machine exists in 2 worlds, one of majestic engineering and another of devastating consequence. It is a reminder that the tools we build often outlive the reasons we built them. The Air Force now expects the B-52 to remain in active service until 2050. If that happens, and the design born on a piece of hotel stationery in 1948 will have served for over a century. It has survived the Cold War, the jungles of Southeast Asia, the deserts of Iraq, and the mountains of Afghanistan. It is no longer just an airplane. It is a permanent fixture of the sky. As the factory where it was born returns to dust, the B-52 continues to circle the globe. A silver ghost that remains exactly as predicted, eternal, terrifying, and impossible to forget.